Well, as we reported earlier in the program, there's escalating tension in the Middle East as Israel and Hamas brace for another outbreak of conflict. Now, this follows a series of Israeli airstrikes on targets in Gaza and rocket attacks by Hamas on Israel. For more on this and where it may well lead, let's speak with Antony Loewenstein. He's a writer, and among his books is one on the Israel-Palestine conflict titled My Israel Question. He's also a co-founder of a group called Independent Australian Jewish Voices, and he joins me in the studio. Antony Loewenstein, good to see you again.
Thanks for having me. Thank you. Why
would have the Israeli forces launched this strike, or this series of strikes now?
The context, I think, is a fewfold. One, this didn't just start yesterday or the day before. What often is ignored by much of the press globally is that Israel continuously actually kills Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Not militants, civilians in Gaza. Over the last 6 months, I was in Israel and Palestine a few months ago, and I was there, at least 3 people were killed. So the context is not simply rockets that are coming from Gaza. The rockets themselves from often various groups, Hamas and others, should be condemned, and I do condemn them. I've condemned them for years. I think they're crazy and completely ill-advised and illegal to target Israeli civilians. But the context of this is not simply retaliation from Israel. It is 2 things, briefly. One, the Israeli elections coming up in January. Netanyahu, as Prime Minister, is likely to win that. He's formed an alliance with Lieberman, who's a Foreign Minister, who's a far-right nationalist who lives in an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. And they want to show, I guess, how strong they are and tough they are. And I was just seeing before, in fact, on Twitter, that in the last 15 years, there's virtually been a war started in every election, apart from 2 of those elections in the last 15 years.
So you think domestic politics is a major driver behind this?
It's a big factor. And the second one is also, we shouldn't forget, at the end of this month, in November, the Palestinian Authority is going to the United Nations to try to get to upgrade the status of Palestine to a non-reservist status. And this, I think, is petrifying Israel and the US. On the ground, it won't change a damn thing. However, what it does potentially do is that it means that Palestine's able to prosecute Israeli ministers and others for potential war crimes. So this is not simply about retaliation, as we're hearing constantly from spokespeople from Israel.
We'll come back to that Palestinian push for statehood in a tick. But in regard to Israel saying that, look, this is for retaliation, and Mark Regev, the Israeli government spokesman, told 7:30 earlier this evening that no UN member would do any less and stand by and watch their own people being shelled, being rocketed from just over the border, in effect. And that is a fair argument, isn't it?
No, I disagree. There's no doubt that it's intolerable that there are individuals who are under rocket fire. That is true. But what is often ignored is that we often frame this, in my view, the wrong way. There's undeniable evidence that as I said, for years, that we shouldn't forget that Gaza's under blockade, has been for 5 years now, 6 years, by Israel and Egypt. The idea somehow that any kind of retaliation from forces within Gaza is terrorism by definition. I mean, if you kill a civilian, which Israel does on a constant basis in the West Bank and in Gaza, that is terrorism. The media doesn't want to call that. It's only terrorism when it's coming from the other side. So retaliation from forces in Gaza in the last few days, we shouldn't also forget, children in the last few days in Gaza were killed. Not militants, children. There were militants too. And obviously the Hamas militant or military leader was assassinated as well. And we shouldn't forget, and the context is often lost in the kind of propaganda we hear from lobbyists from the Israeli side, is that this individual who's arguably done difficult and illegal things over the years was one of the people, in fact, who was holding a ceasefire. There has been a Cold War of sorts between Israel and Gaza and Hamas for years.
Well, why would they target Ahmed Jabri if he has been calling for calm and has been calling for, if not peace, then certainly a cessation to hostilities for the moment?
We can't underestimate, Scott, the reality of Israeli domestic politics. And the history of this, as I said, for the last decades is very clear that when Israel feels like it needs to prove itself internationally and domestically, you lash out. There's a military doctrine that Israel has had for a number of years, which talks about acting like a crazy country, a country that can unleash mad violence on an unprecedented scale. The condemnation comes from who? The US, they support. Australia will probably support it. Most of the West supports it. There are some Arab states like Egypt, and of course the Egyptian role here is quite key. In the last Gaza massacre in 2008 and 9, when Mubarak was president, he supported the war uncritically. We now have a Muslim Brotherhood president precedent next door. And the test really is going to be, as the leading Arab country, arguably, what their response will be. They have expressed the fact that they're upset. They've withdrawn their ambassador from Israel. And when Israel, and we often forget this, when Israel itself commits terrorism, it's responsible, in my view, on us as individuals, in my case as a Jew, as citizens, to actually come out and say, if sides that are not friendly to us are committing acts of terrorism on all sides. I'm not saying that Israel and Palestinians don't commit terrorism as well. Every side does. But disproportionately, when you attack a country, as Israel has done in Gaza for years and years and years, that doesn't get reported like it's what's happening now.
But Israel says what they do are surgical strikes.
It's not true.
Such as,
But this is not true.
Occasionally there is collateral damage, to use their term, but it's surgical strikes as opposed to indiscriminate rocket firing coming from the other side.
Well, I think the evidence for that is overwhelmingly untrue. I mean, the fact is we hear this, that the US has surgical strikes in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and having spent some time in those countries, you realise the reality on the ground is civilians are routinely killed. In Gaza, you have civilians who are being killed. Children, not militants, children. There was a guy, 2 children this week who are playing soccer killed. They're not militants, not firing guns, they haven't got weapons, they're being killed. And I think the history of Operation Cast Lead, the last Gaza war, the Goldstone report, the infamous report, the detail of what Israel did, details in amazing amount of information that war crimes were committed by Israel, the deliberate targeting of civilians. We often don't want to think about the fact that a so-called democracy like Israel targets civilians. It does. Deliberately targets civilians. And Operation Cast Lead, the evidence of that was clear. Now, thus far, obviously, this so-called conflict, it's not a war now. This is not a war. This is basically 2 unequal sides. Gaza, I was there a few years ago, just after the Operation Cast Lead. And the situation there, civilian areas, not militant areas, civilian areas were flattened. And that's not about terrorism, that's about saying that somehow deterrence is our mission. But if Israel says that, after so many years of deterring Palestine, where are they? Israel is more insecure now than it's ever been in its history.
You said it's not war at the moment. How do you think this could play out? What will be Hamas's reaction? How may that ripple out?
Well, militarily, as we saw 4 years ago, and interestingly, roughly the same time after Obama won the election last time before he became inaugurated, so roughly the same time 4 years ago, there wasn't a war. Hamas militarily cannot beat an Israeli military, but what did happen was Hamas was left standing. And the fear, I think, is this time that if there is a ground invasion, which Israel is talking about, I mean, one looks on Twitter, and it's incredible when you have IDF, Israeli Defense Force spokespeople on Twitter, proudly talking about killing people. Not talking about militants, talking about Israeli official spokespeople on Twitter, proudly talking about killing individuals. That the fear is that if there is a ground invasion, there'll be, as there was in Operation Cast Lead, 1,500 people were killed, of which the vast majority were civilians. And the fear is that, the irony, in fact, is that Israel actually does not want Hamas not to run Gaza. Because if you overthrow Hamas, you have to run the place. You have to control. You have to actually look after the 1.6 million Palestinians. They don't want to do that. So the idea, I think, in theory, is that somehow you destroy as much as military capability as possible. But the civilians, Scott, are the ones, having seen it myself, who are the ones who are suffering. Not the militants, the civilians.
You mentioned before Egypt. Now, right up into recent days, Egypt has been trying to broker a truce of some nature. As you mentioned, the Egyptian ambassador to Israel has been withdrawn. What do you think will be the outcome here for Egypt-Israel relations that are crucial, and therefore what effect could this have regionally? And then looking even further afield, where to for the US and what role they may play?
Well, the Egyptian, just briefly, the Egyptian role is key. I mean, clearly internally there is profound anti-Israel sentiment. There are protests that are happening as we speak in Cairo and elsewhere. So the Muslim Brotherhood obviously has a history of being very critical of Israel, that's clear. And the sentiment within Israel, within Egypt, I should say, for many years, in fact, has been, if not severing the peace treaty with Israel, certainly curtailing it or changing it. But we shouldn't forget one very important point. One, that Egypt relies on $1.3 billion of military aid from the US annually. And that really almost twists their arm behind their back semi-permanently. But there's no doubt that if there is a war or there's an actual ground invasion, What Egypt could do if it can't stop the war is certainly to open its borders on the Egyptian side, which was not the case 4 years ago. So 4 years ago, there were civilians who were unable to get out and get medical care. That was sealed. In the wider context of the region, well, Syria clearly has supported Hamas in the past, but Assad's regime clearly is fighting its own insurgency. Iran clearly supports Hamas as well, but it's also dealing with its own internal questions, and its economy is in pretty bad shape. Regionally, the Arab states, Scott, for years, classically, have been useless on the Palestinian question. They speak about supporting Palestine, but in fact, they actually receive money and backing from Israel and the US, most. In terms of Obama, just quickly, the Obama administration supports Israel, has said they'll support Israel. Obama, in the last 4 years on this question, has been a disaster. As Israel continues to expand settlements and apartheid there deepens, which is what is happening in Palestine, the reality is that Israel, in fact, by its own actions, is making its existence impossible, because without a two-state solution for Israel, which is what it claims it wants to do and where it wants to go, it's a one-state equation, which is where it's going, and that means a majority Palestinian state.
Author Antony Loewenstein, I was hoping to talk to you about the Palestinian statehood push. We've run out of time. It'll have to be another time to discuss that. Appreciate your perspective tonight.
Thank you.
Well, the US military has suspended the security clearances of the two women at the centre of the David Petraeus scandal. The CIA chief resigned this week after